Hello and welcome back to the Tiberium Armory series, where today we're going to be going over what will probably be the first of several videos surrounding the economy and state of the world over the course of the Tiberium Wars. I had planned on these videos being quite long, but whether they end up being the size of the MCV videos remains to be seen. Today we're going to be talking about the finances of the world in and around the First Tiberium War, and man, is that a mind-boggling process, because there's a tremendous amount of money being used on the war. And I mean, you would be surprised at just the mind-boggling numbers involved in this. Only the first of the 3 Tiberium Wars. In the past, I've done videos about the medium tank and others like the stealth tank, and then you could sort of see how in a futuristic setting they might be developed over the course of a dozen years and put out to the tune of maybe $10 to $20 million per unit, and maybe $50 to $100 million in development, depending on the particular item involved. Well, some of the things we're going to be talking about today will blow those out of the water. Some of these things, the development costs of these, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and some of them, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars just to get the items into space. It is just mind-boggling. And almost 2 minutes into the video here, I want to apologize for my voice. I have been down with COVID, and that sort of upset my school and really recording schedule, because I was planning to work on this video last week and I didn't get a whole lot of chances to because of COVID and because of school. But now I'm back and I'm working on it, and hopefully, I don't know how long this is going to take to make, but I'll probably be done next week. Next week from the day 11/22/22. We shall see. At the moment I'm kind of nasally, and I hope that doesn't bother anybody. In the meantime here, we're going to first take a look at the state of the world when the Tiberium hits the Earth in 1995. On December 31st, 1995, the world GDP was $30.87 trillion US dollars. The US and the G7 countries taking up the highest percentage of that, and parts of Asia taking up the second. At this point, it is unknown how much of that percentage NOD had already acquired, as their plans were already in motion by this time. But it is safe to say, from what we hear from the first game, Tiberium Dawn, they were very, very capable of rapidly gaining control of the Tiberium reserves on the planet, garnering an incredibly lucrative new industry for themselves, while the rest of the world was baffled about what this resource could be used for, or even whether or not it was dangerous. Some scientists even came out and said that it was a beneficial form of life, very possibly under the payroll of NOD already, to come out with that kind of a statement, when all it would have taken is close proximity to the Tiberium to show what kind of dangerous effects it has on the human body. The extent of how much NOD had embedded into the rest of the world, that's a video for another time. Right now, we just need to look at the state of the world at that point. Now, with Tiberium as a relatively contained and emergent technology, without having the time for Tiberium to really start taking over the planet, it is really only a good thing. At this point, Tiberium is only improving the GDP of the countries that it's attached to. Although we have to take into account that, like when it landed in a winery, which means that it very quickly took over and destroyed the business of the person that owned the winery. The further it would spread, the more it would go to dominate areas with wildlife and forests and fields, and start to destroy the native populations in those areas, destroying the business that requires lots of land to start, which in the beginning in Italy was not much of a problem because Italy was never the breadbasket of the world. But as Nod would bring Tiberium to other parts of the world, then you'd start to see some very dangerous things start to happen. One that could be particularly interesting to look at now is Ukraine. In this time period, the Russian Federation had been absorbed into the G7 countries and was largely under control. Now, this means no Ukrainian war, but in our timeline, the Ukraine that we know today is under occupation partially by Russia. Now, Ukraine supplies massive amounts of wheat and other foodstuffs to other parts of the world. And losing that breadbasket has caused prices to increase on foods across the board, across the world. Now imagine this happening in the American Midwest, in parts of South America, and parts of the entire world, and you start to see entire industries go down the tubes. In terms of the first Tiberium War, though, I am going to take an assumption, and I am going to say that the growth of the Tiberium industry directly offsets the loss of other industries up until the interregnum between the first Tiberium War and the second. At that point, when Tiberium starts to take over the planet, turn areas into yellow and red zones, that's when all fair game is lost there. We start to lose huge percentages of the world economy, we start to lose huge amounts of trade, and into the third Tiberium War, we start to lose huge parts of the ocean to Tiberium, which completely negates most of the shipping trade that we have in the world right now. According to a Google search, around 80% of global trade volume and over 70% of global trade by value are carried by sea and handled by ports worldwide. Now, if you lose access to all of these ports because the ocean level drops down, that means that there is no more trade, essentially. Everything has to be done by air, and air does not have the same kind of volume, which means that the world economy is basically going to collapse and is going to be run entirely off of Tiberium and what can be grown in the areas that are not affected by Tiberium. And I want to make no mistake here, in this video, one of the big parts about it is going to be talking about the unbelievably massive death toll that takes place over the course of these games. Likely billions have died by the time of the Third Tiberium War, and very likely, since the fourth game does not exist, billions more will die if the world doesn't get the Tiberium under control. It is very possible that Earth will have to be abandoned before even the screen get the chance to show up. Setting that aside, however, let's take a look at the GDP of the G8 countries some 24 years later, in 2019, when the first Tiberium War officially starts. Now, like I said earlier, taking into account that the economy is kind of balanced out by the fact that the loss of trade is balanced by the exploitation of Tiberium. The GDP of the G8 countries, which includes Canada, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, is around $41.406 trillion. This represents around 47% of the world's entire GDP. On the other hand, the states that have declared for Nod in the beginning of the war include Ukraine, Romania, Serbia, Macedonia, Latvia, Croatia, Herzegovina, Slovakia, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, China, Cambodia, Vietnam, North Korea, Jordan, Thailand, Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, Estonia, Morocco, West Sahara, Algeria, Libya, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Sudan, Zaire, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Angola, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. All these countries have declared for nod at the beginning of the game, and their collective GDP is around 20.217861 trillion, which accounts for about 23.06% of the world's GDP. Now, nod is also sort of a Illuminati organization, so this does not take into account how much money they would have had in reserves by the time that they shown themselves in the world. This also does not take into account the amount of infrastructure that they would have already set up before the war that they don't have to spend money on. Taking into account that NOD has been active, at least behind the scenes, for generations and generations before the start of the game, before everyone is aware of them. But what do these GDPs mean for the game, for our discussion here? Well, the simplest way to explain this is a little factoid that I found very interesting when I found it the other day. Did you know that the United States spent as much as 40% of its GDP on the war in World War II? That is a lot of money to be spent on any war. And while that is dwarfed by the amount of money that is spent on war today, the percentage of GDP spent on war is only a fraction of that. I think it's safe to say, however, that in a Third World War situation, the GDP being spent on the war will likely be around the same amount. And predicting what this amount should be for our calculations is difficult, because some countries, like the United States, spent 60% of their GDP, while other countries, like Germany and the UK, spent closer to 100% of their GDP. Technically, the UK spent something closer to 120% because of the Lend-Lease program and all of the money that the United States was giving them in forms of goods and hard cash. For the purposes of this particular war, I will say that there will be something like 60 to 80% of GDP being spent on the war throughout the entire war period, which means at the higher estimate of 80%, $33.1248 trillion is the GDP spendable on the war by the G8 countries in GDI. For NOD, that number comes out to around $16.174 trillion available to use on the war, with the caveat that large amounts of these nations are only providing small amounts of their GDP, because places like Mali, Niger, Ethiopia, and Cameroon don't have a whole lot of gross domestic product to spare. They're likely going to be contributing in the form of raw materials. So this number may vary depending on how you measure it. Now, put together, this represents a unbelievably incredible 56% of the world's GDP going into this one war. That is unbelievable. And keeping that number in mind is important because of the amount of money that has to be spent on the infrastructure to be able to do the things that the factions do in the games. Before we even start getting to the things that you might see the Kodiak doing, for instance. Huge percentages of this money will be going into research and development that will lead to the factions, technology, and units that we will see throughout all of the games. But other percentages just need to be getting started at getting the infrastructure needed to begin creating these things. So, for instance, we're going to need to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps billions of dollars, developing the MCV and other portable construction vehicles and buildings to be able to construct vehicles and buildings in the field. One good way of sort of making this a little bit easier to visualize is by taking into account the development of the space assets that are in use in GDI by the time of the First Tiberium War. This comes to assumption number 2. Around 25 Generation 1 ion cannons are in place all across the globe to act as an effective counter to the nuclear missiles in possession of many of Nod's nations, subject nations. How much money will it take to get all of that into space and developed? Well, that is a very good question, and I have done some preliminary guesswork and mathematics to try to get the ballpark estimates in here, which I will put up on screen now. As a way to visualize this, we will start by looking at the International Space Station, which has existed from 1994 up until now, and has cost a total amount of $150 billion, according to Google. Now, actually getting the thing into space and fully operational took around $60 billion. And a good amount of that money is getting the materials into space, which was mostly done by shuttle, which as much as 32 tons into space at a time, each flight costing around $450 million. Taking development of the Generation 1 ion cannons and the purchasing price into consideration, along with the 25 trips up the orbit in the space shuttles, I have estimated that the entire project will cost around $150 billion, with this number going up to as much as $300 billion, depending on how much technology is already available to accomplish the destructive tasks available to the cannons in the game. Now, there has to be something up there to coordinate all of these satellites across the world, and I could assume that that might be the International Space Station, but that is definitely not what it was built for. So another command and repair station that is not the Philadelphia would have to be built, which would cost around $60 billion. Another thing that might be needed for the installation of the Generation 1 ion cannons is a installation station that will catch the materials and distribute them across the system. This would be the first bit of infrastructure needed to construct items in space. That will cost an additional $60 billion. And then to expand the space shuttle program to fit all of the shuttles that will need to be used to bring all of this to space will cost another $80 billion. Now, that is quite a bit of money just for the first war, just in getting the space operations set up. That's about $360 billion in total, but that is not actually a very large number, as we're not taking into account maintenance and the amount that I have projected that the GDI will have to spend over the course of all of the wars just on space assets is around $4.869 trillion. That's including a moon base, which might be necessary in constructing some parts of the Kodiak and getting it off planet. That would run around $100 billion. An upgrade program to the Generation 2 ion cannons, which would run around $100 billion. The Philadelphia, the initial version, running $833 billion. The Kodiak, running $500 billion. The Philadelphia upgrade to its current form before it was destroyed, $300 billion. The Generation 3 ion cannons, which individually cost around $92.68 billion US dollars, rounding up, of course, for all of the miscellaneous costs to $100 billion over 10 years to install. All 25 of these will cost around $2.5 trillion. And finally, the expansion of the installation station, $200 billion. Now, restricting it back, in Tiberium Dawn, it is likely that anywhere between $365 to $325 billion will be spent between 2005 and 2019 on the space infrastructure alone. Now, this is a lot of money, but compared to the $33.1248 trillion that they have access to on 2019, this is not a whole lot of money. So my guess is that the largest percentage of the money that is going to be spent will be in the R&D programs that will result in the Wolverine, the Titan, the Mammoth, and all of the other vehicles that will show up over the course of the years. This is a period of unimaginable innovation. Why the research primarily? Well, most of the assets that are available in the First Tiberium War are actually going to be something that we don't see in-game in either Renegade or Tiberium Dawn. That is going to be the previous post-Cold War era and Cold War era weapons. Given that 24 years is not enough to fully develop and begin producing dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and hundreds of these new weapons. It is likely only in the key battles that we see the advanced vehicles that we might expect from the games being in play. Keeping these amounts in mind, let's move back to the GDP of the various countries to talk about the state of the world. In the first game, I would say that the loss of trade and the loss of various businesses to Tiberium is a mitigating factor compared to the exploitation of Tiberium in this first war. But afterwards, in Tiberian Sun and Tiberium Wars, the economic effect of the massive amount of loss in all features of life, to loss of factories, to loss of farms, to loss of high industry and trade, has meant that it is likely that the world economy is down at least 30% by the time of Tiberian Sun, or by the time of the end of the war. By the time we get to Tiberium Wars, the economy is likely 50% down in general, with 50% of the world's GDP exclusively coming from Tiberium exploitation. It has now become too difficult to find minerals in any other way than to derive them from Tiberium, and hundreds of millions, if not billions of people have died in the yellow zones and the red zones due to Tiberium infestation and radiation. Now, in the lore, it does say that large amounts of the red zones were evacuated. However much this could have actually been is unknowable, however. As a period of around 10 years to evacuate hundreds of millions of people in extremely dangerous environments is not enough time. And with Tiberium expanding every day, it is likely that as much as 60% of the people within those areas died before they could be evacuated, and many more of them were likely completely affected by the radiation by that time period, leading to long, agonizing deaths. This means that massive portions of the world economy, unbelievably huge part of world industry, will simply cease to exist. They will cease functioning. And into Tib Wars, where the oceans start to get drained, it is likely that trade as we know it has ceased, and we are starting to get a sort of state capitalism being implemented by both NOD and GDI to feed and house the populace in an ever-shrinking world. This system, thrown on by necessity, is incredibly weak, however, and will, guaranteed, without the special knowledge of the Tacitus, or without a way out through the portal, likely lead to the world being completely destroyed, completely hollowed out of life, and when the Skrin inevitably arrive, whether in a year from the end of Tiberium Wars or within 100, completely depending on their FTL travel times, it is likely that nothing will remain on Earth but the dried husks of people, their infrastructure, their buildings, and the Tiberium crystals sitting there waiting to be harvested by their alien overlords. Further evidence of the decay of the world's economy comes with the introduction of the credit system. So instead of using US dollars as the world currency will now be traded in credits, which means that the oil system that the world had been living under no longer exists. All money comes from the state, and all jobs exist for the state. Life on Earth is hell, and with nothing coming in the future but either a trap laid by Cain or a giant alien armada, I can't give us very many good chances. On the other hand, in the blue zones and in some areas of the yellow zones, we're likely to see a tremendous amount of growth in the building industries. We've seen pictures of the blue zones where there are these sort of pyramid-shaped farms or something that seem to be all across the landscape. And it seems that, like in the Roman Empire in the declining days, building programs run the economy to help create extra defenses and to create new skylines to aggrandize and to put to work large sections of the population which would otherwise be destitute. So there is that one bit that if you live in a blue zone, your skyline is likely to look unbelievable. Anyway, this has been the end of the first video on the state of the world in the First Tiberium War. More videos will come about the state of the world during other Tiberium Wars and in different formats. For instance, the next video will be about the state of nature in the First Tiberium War into the Second, and the unbelievably massive loss of biomass across the entire world that we see in the short years between 1994 and 2048. As a last bit here at the end, I am interested to see if anyone would like to see my notes on how I came up with the numbers or manipulate them in any way. I am not an economist and I am not a mathematician, so if I am wrong in any areas, please do tell me. If you are interested in that, I will post a Excel spreadsheet, or I will post a link to a Google Docs or something, and you will be able to have access to all the materials that I am using. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day. This has been Game Master Karakin, and I will be signing off now. Thank you.